I'm going to introduce my friend and colleague, KRISTA Kais. I thought her name was Keys for so long. I'm sure I'm not the only one, but it's been a pleasure to work for KRISTA and know her for all these years. She and I think I was at the end of one study abroad trip that I did to Ireland, and she showed up after. I'm not sure why, but somehow we crossed lines and ended up meeting in Dublin, and it was a wonderful experience. And I saw her love for the country even then. That was many years ago now. Well, not. Oh, 5. Okay, that's better. Anyway, it was a wonderful experience, and I could tell that that the place meant a lot to her. I didn't know how much, but we'll all find out this evening. KRISTA's been a friend and a colleague for many years. She's inspired countless numbers of students with her warmth and her generous spirit, her stories, most recently about her adopted home, Dublin. Last year, she took a one-year sabbatical to earn an MFA in creative writing from University College Dublin. While there, she studied with writers like Frank McGuinness and Gavin Corbett, edited a literary magazine, taught creative writing, attended book launches, readings, literary festivals, and she wrote. Ireland's first female president was her neighbor. Yeats's birthplace was right at the end of her street. She ran on Sandymount Strand, which is along the Irish Sea, which I guess that's it, right? That's Sandymount Strand. In the evening with a full moon, it's awesome. I mean, it's incredible. And it's wonderful, particularly when the tide is out. But the daily routine of running along a beautiful strand like that. She attended Joyce readings, James Joyce readings, and volunteered at Sweeney's Chemist, which is featured in Joyce's masterpiece, Ulysses. And that experience was always followed by pints across the street at Kennedy's Pub, which I know very well too. Turns out Oscar Wilde worked there when he was 14 years old. So it's kind of like we were talking during the roundtable with Chris and Molly earlier. Sometimes you're in a place where history just envelops you, you know? And in the case of Dublin, it's not just the history, but the literary history, you know? And it really does. I mean, everywhere you look, you're facing it. And it's a wonderful reminder of the centrality that literature plays in that culture. So she spent the year also, this past year in the sabbatical, getting to know her Irish cousins in Mullingar, which is west of Dublin. But she only discovered these cousins in 2014, 5 years ago, realizing that my people are over there in Mullingar. She'd go out there for weekend visits and came back to Dublin and she wrote. What we'll hear from KRISTA and Molly this evening is how a place can become a character. A place can become a character. But I didn't make this idea up. This is what they've been saying for over 100 years about James Joyce, that he wrote about dear, dirty Dublin in such a way that it took on a human air. It became as central to the telling as the characters themselves. We will not hear, you guys, about the cliched Lucky Charms leprechaun notion of Ireland. You know. We're going to hear about the human dimension and the extent to which that particular place, that small green island, can inspire stories that remind us of our shared humanity, no matter the accent or the distance, how precious it is, and how easily we can lose it. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome KRISTA Kais.
Thanks. Thank you, Neil. So I'll do this. It means a lot to me to be able to share my experiences of Ireland with you guys and some of my writing. I wanted to display this particular photo during the reading to tell you a little bit about it because I think it really captures a sense of my time in Ireland. The backstory is I was walking home one night from a cafe where I'd been writing, and I noticed that the moon was full. So I walked, this is about last April, and I just decided to walk out toward the water to see the moon reflecting on the water. And because the tide was out, when the tide goes out in Sandymount Strand, it goes way, way, way out. And so I walked along the sand up into the water's edge, and I noticed another photographer. He had a tripod, and he was kind of over there. We just minded our own business. took some photos on my iPhone, and they didn't turn out great because it's an iPhone. And a few weeks later, one of these Instagram accounts that I follow, it's like Discover Dublin or something, featured this photographer who mostly publishes pictures of Sandy Mount Strand, and I clicked through to his account and saw this picture. So that night, of all the photos that he took of the moonlight on the water, the one that he ended up posting was the one he took of me, which was interesting. And I contacted him, and he said he would happily send me the file. So I thought it captures not only sort of like kind of just exactly my life in Dublin. I spent so much time by myself. I always had that backpack on. I always had that purple jacket. And I had the time to go look at the moon. You know, I think that's the magic of a sabbatical, is that you have the time to kind of like really take it all in. So as you'll hear, there's I'm really grateful to have been able to spend not only a year on sabbatical, but a year in that particular place. So the piece I'm going to read tonight is a new piece of writing. I didn't write this in Dublin, but only recently. And it's part of a book I'm working on that's based in my time on my time in Ireland. It's, the working title for the book is Happiness is Upon Me, which is, in the Irish language, there's no way to say I'm happy, but the way that they say it is happiness is upon me, because they recognize that it's not a state of being, but it's something that comes to you and will eventually go, which is same for sadness, which is a kind of nice feeling, or kind of a nice concept, that it's not something that you are, but something that comes and goes. So one quick thing before I start, when you hear the word crack being used, this is actually a word the Irish use to refer to having a good time, and it's spelled C-R-A-I-C. It's just to clarify that the characters are not talking about using drugs. So the piece that I'm going to read now is called What I Don't Yet Know. Okay. On the way to PMAX, I see a crowd of people spilling out of the Ballsbridge pubs. It's one of those rare Saturdays in Dublin when the temperature has reached 68 and we're all losing our minds. When the sun comes out here, nobody knows how long it will stay, so we all head into town to, as they say, have a bit of crack. Right now, what I don't yet know is there'll be more days like this, that it's just the beginning of the longest, hottest heat wave Dublin has seen in 42 years, that these gorgeous days will last for 3 months, and my relationship with Tig, who I'm about to meet for the first time, will last only 1 week. But now in this cab, I don't know any of this. Right now, I'm still full of butterflies and hope, and I wish the cab driver would go faster because I'm already 10 minutes late. Earlier today, Greta and I were lounging on her couch watching the royal wedding on TV. She sat on one end, 6 months pregnant, and quietly wiping tears from her eyes, and I sat on the other end, drinking a Heineken I found in her fridge. "Are you going to call Tig?" she asked. He was a friend of a friend, and they'd been scheming to set us up. "How do you pronounce his name?" I asked. "Tig," she said, and then pulled out her phone to show me his photo again. He was tall and wearing a strange outfit, black shorts with a red shirt, a gold trim, and a blue bandana on his head. He was standing in tall grass, and there was an elephant behind him. He had a trimmed beard and thick eyebrows. He was cute. I left Greta's around 3 in the afternoon with nothing else to do. Standing on the DART platform at Connolly Station in the sun, I looked at all the young people, the girls wearing too much makeup, sitting on each other's laps, the boys wearing shorts, looking at their phones. On the train, I took out my phone and sent a text asking what he was doing on this lovely day, and he wrote back as I got off at Sandy Mount. He said he was very much enjoying the splash of sun and watching rugby at the pub. He asked if I wanted to meet for a pint. We decided on PMAX, a dark pub filled with tall red candles. Every time I come in here, I wonder how it hasn't burnt to the ground. I'm looking for Tig, but the photo Greta showed me was blurry, and now I'm not really sure who I'm looking for. When I approach the bar, I see a tall man in a black t-shirt with a thin silver chain around his neck. I pause. He turns his head to the side, and he's so conventionally handsome that I almost hope it's not him. But I know it is, so I move closer and say hello. His eyes smile when he sees me. He asks if I fancy a pint in an accent that almost sounds Scottish. "Whatever you're having," I say. Tig asks why I moved to Dublin, and I give him my go-to answer, saying I'm doing a master's program. But when he presses and says, "But of all places, why Ireland?" I tell him my great-grandmother is from here, that I've always loved it here, that I love literary history. I'm boring myself with these answers, but I find it difficult to explain why I love this place, and I always feel flustered when I try. I imagine it's similar to trying to explain why you love your child or your dog. Whatever you say is bound to come out all wrong, all cheesy and sentimental. I don't tell him that I knew Ireland felt like home to me before I ever stepped foot in this country. How from the moment I first visited Dublin 4 years ago, it felt deeply familiar, more than any place I'd ever been. I don't tell him about the Ireland-shaped birthmark on my back. I don't tell him about the amount of time I've daydreamed about this little country the way people daydream about their crush. I don't tell him about how before I left America, my friends predicted that I would fall in love and never come back. When he asks if I like it here, I say yes, and when he asks why, I say, honestly, I love the weather, and he looks at me like I have 4 heads. When he notices the yes badge on my purse, he asks if I'm a feminist, and I say, yeah, are you? He says, yeah, but he can't vote for the repeal on Friday because he's from the North. He suggests we change the subject, and I agree. Okay, he says, looking around for what to say next. His face is lovely in the candlelight. So, he says, what's the most beautiful place you've ever seen? The Cliffs of Moher, I say. He laughs like he knew this would be my answer, like that's what every American would say. I tell him I've been to the cliffs 4 times, and each time has been different. Once under the big blue sky, once under low gray clouds, once in the rain, once with fog so dense I couldn't see 10 feet in front of me. I don't say how I really feel about the cliffs, how they seem alive to me, like their walls are vibrating. I don't say that they feel like the passage between heaven and earth. I don't say that I can feel my grandmother and my great-grandmother in the wind on the tops of those cliffs. I don't try to describe the sound of the ocean slamming against their walls or the strangeness of hearing all those different birds singing below. I don't talk about the thrill of standing on the edge, knowing you're a wind gust away from your death. I don't say that I went there for the first time when I was 20, and the sight of them, even in the pouring rain, felt spiritual, or how afterward, as I dried my cold red cheeks with a paper towel in the visitor center bathroom, I knew I'd find a way to move back here one day. Tag says, I've actually never been. When I ask about the most beautiful thing he's ever seen, he tells me that there was this one day when he was traveling in Thailand last year. He says that he's not a strong swimmer, but one day on a snorkeling trip, he spent the whole day in the water just floating, looking up at the sky and down at the fish below. He stayed there until sunset. He says he was so incredibly scared and also somehow totally at peace. I can imagine him floating with a painted sky behind him. He sips his pint and asks if I want to have children someday. I don't have a fast and ready answer for this one. So I say the most honest thing I possibly can. Remember what you said about floating in the water in Thailand, I said? That's how I feel about having kids. His next question is lighter than the previous ones. He asks if I've ever had an espresso martini and if I want to go find one. Outside of PMAX, the streets are still buzzing with people and there's a chill in the air. Tig leads me down South Georgia Street to a quiet bar with outdoor seating where we ask the waitress for 2 espresso martinis and she looks puzzled. She comes back with 2 wine glasses filled with a concoction of white wine, sparkling water, and something else I find difficult to swallow. I take another sip and say, it tastes like chicken water. Tig says, tastes it and says, oh, it's definitely chicken water. We both take another drink and then laugh so hard that we're doubled over. Then the moment comes, the one where you're feeling so much happiness that you suddenly feel sad. And I realize how bittersweet it is to laugh this hard with a man I just met, knowing I'll always remember this moment, either fondly or sadly, depending on how this goes. A couple of women walk by our table, and one of them yells, gorgeous couple, without even stopping. I think everyone in Dublin must be drunk tonight. Next, he takes me to Whelan's and tells me that this is where they filmed the famous scene in the movie P.S. I Love You. American girls love that film, he says. I tell him I thought it was okay. At the bar, he orders 2 pints, and because he's a whole foot taller than me, he has to bend down to yell into my ear over the music. He says his brother is the guy who's actually singing Galway Girl on the soundtrack to that movie, and the producers recorded it without his permission and never paid him. I think there's no way that's true. Next, he asks me if I'm a good cook, and I say, yeah, I'm okay. We head over to the next room where it's dark and the music is loud and everyone is dancing. He bounces on the dance floor and scoops me up and spins me. Later, walking down Harcourt Street at 3 a.m., trying to find a cab, I can smell the trees blooming, and the waxing moon is still high in the sky. The birds are singing, and I think to myself that Dublin at 3 a.m. in the late spring, when the horizon is starting to turn light blue, is the second most beautiful thing I've ever seen. A week later, it's 70 degrees, and we're all melting. I wander in and out of the shops on Henry Street before meeting Tig for our second date. I start to sweat as I cross O'Connell Bridge, and it surprises me how my body's adjusted to the climate here, how 70 degrees feels hot to me now. The city's buzzing more than I've ever seen, and every other person is wearing a repeal jumper. Down by the quays, I see a group of women walking in pairs, dressed in robes and white bonnets like those from The Handmaid's Tale. There are at least 20 of them. On the pole directly above them are two signs, one featuring the face of Savita Halappanavar and the words, "Never again." Another says, "Vote yes, stop shaming women." On the north side of the river, there's a billboard-sized sheet hanging across the front of a 5-story building that says, "A woman you love might need your yes," along with today's date, May 25th. There are volunteers set up at the foot of the Halfpenny Bridge, reminding people that they have until 10 o'clock to vote. When I walk into Pig, I see Tig at the bar, and he's ordered 2 espresso martinis and a pint. When I touch his arm and say hello, he explains that he was planning to drink the pint while he waited for me. Outside, we find a table in the sun to share with another couple. When I try the espresso martini and say that it tastes much better than chicken water, he smiles politely and says, "Sorry, I don't know what that means." "You don't remember the chicken water?" I ask. "It rings a bell," he says, "but I don't remember much of that night." "Oh," I say, "do you remember saying the producers of P.S. I Love You stole the audio of your brother singing Galway Girl?" He laughs and says, "Sometimes I just make things up." I turn toward the couple sharing our table and say that I like their Yes t-shirts. We make small talk, and when they're done with their pints, they leave. Then, right there on that loud, sunny patio bar, surrounded by happy, tipsy Dubliners, Tig says, "I don't know how to say this, but I think we should just be friends." He gives a flurry of reasons. "You're too smart for me. You're going back to America. I don't want to be in a relationship. I'd love to be friends with you," he says. "We could have all the crack." He apologizes over and over, and I ask him to stop. He says, "I can tell you're upset," to which I respond, "You need to get over yourself." The harshness of my words stings us both, and I realize I wasn't just saying it to him, but to all the ones who came before him. He gets up and comes back with 3 pints, 2 for him and 1 for me. It's awkward at first, but eventually he says something to make me laugh and then says, "Well, now you're coming around." When he asks again if I'm a good cook, I say, "Yeah, you asked me that before." His eyes are glassy now, and he says that he already met the love of his life, but that she died, and then says he doesn't want to talk about it. He gets himself another round of drinks. He tells me he comes from a long line of alcoholics and says all Irish people hate themselves anyway. He says we shouldn't let such a beautiful night go to waste, and he wants to go to another bar. As we walk down Clarendon Street, I think that I should just go home. It's after 9 and the sun is setting now. It's cold, and I wish I had brought my jacket. The next bar we go to is dark and loud, and he yells into my ear that he wants to take me home. There it is. I act like I can't hear him, and I say that I need to go to the bathroom. In the stall, I place my pint on the gross, wet floor with no intention of picking it back up. I wipe the tears from my eyes and take out my phone to distract myself. The first thing I see is a headline saying the 8th Amendment has been repealed by a landslide, and I begin to cry harder. I'm crying a century's worth of tears for the Irish women, for the ones who were shamed, jailed, enslaved, or died. I'm crying because Tig really thought that I would say yes. I'm crying because this feels like the opposite of what's happening in my country. I'm crying because it feels like the end of an era for all of us. Eventually, I feel bad for taking up a stall, so I go out by the sinks, wiping my face, and as I wash my hands, all the women stop what they're doing and rush toward me. "He's not worth it," they all say. I pull myself together for long enough to find Tig, yell into his ear that I'm tired, and leave. Walking along St. Stephen's Green, I wipe my face. A woman on the sidewalk says, "Honey, are you okay?" And I say, I'm fine. And near the Shelbourne, I get a cab to go home. I wake up with a headache, without leaving my bed, I pull the curtain to see that it's another beautiful day. I want to go back to sleep, but I told my classmate Anne I'd meet her in town so she could give me a tarot card reading. What I don't yet know is that when I reach the city center, women will be singing in the streets, or that at the end of my tarot card reading, Anne will pull the strength card, depicting an image of a woman taming a lion, and Anne will smile and say, "Oh, this is a very good card." I will meet up with Greta, and we'll walk over to the square in Dublin Castle to hear the final votes counted. I'll run into the couple Tig and I shared the table with at the pub, and they'll ask how the rest of the date went. I'll say, "We decided to just be friends," and they'll look puzzled. I'll go back to Greta's house, and she'll cook dinner and then draw me a bath. And in the bath, I'll think about how Greta is going to be a great mom, and I'll wonder if there's a guy who will ever care for me the way my female friends have. I'll step out of the bath and sleep in Greta's guest room under a soft white duvet. The next morning, I'll wake to the sound of thunder, and it will be the most beautiful sound I ever heard. What I don't yet know is that Tig will text me every Thursday evening for the next 3 weeks, asking what I have planned for the weekend, and then tell me that he's very busy, but we should get together soon. What I don't yet know is that I will eventually tell him to leave me alone. What I don't yet know is that in a few weeks, I'll meet a man named Sam who will change everything. One sec. What I don't yet know is how despite how I feel now, I'll look back and say this was the best summer of my life. I'll take a trip to Dingle in June and learn that there's no way to say I'm happy in Irish, that instead they say happiness is upon me. All summer long, shopkeepers, bartenders, cab drivers will talk nonstop about the weather, about the heat and the sun, and they'll tell me over and over how incredibly lucky I am to be here now. I know, I'll say to them with a feeling of gratitude that makes me want to weep. I know. Thanks. That's it. Okay, so now it's my pleasure to introduce Molly McCloskey. So today is International Women's Day, as Neil told us, and although we didn't plan the reading for today on purpose, it seems appropriate considering Molly's novel, which begins with a love affair but ends so beautifully with the protagonist remembering her mother and moving forward in her life. I was first introduced to Molly McCloskey's novel, When Light is Like Water, now called Straying, about a year ago while living in Dublin. It was recommended to me by two people in a very short time span. One was my professor, Paul Perry, our mutual acquaintance, who recommended it as an example of masterful novel structure. And one was my friend Lauren, a fellow writer who said the story and the writing were heartbreakingly beautiful. They were both right, and what stood out to me upon the first read was not just the insight into love's dark corners, as Anne Enright puts it, but also the deep wisdom that can be found on each page. In the novel, which the Irish Times calls a love letter to Ireland, we are transported into Alice's inner world, unsure of where she belongs now that her mother is gone, while remembering her 20s as she tried to navigate the role of the Irish wife and the summer her marriage eventually fell apart. It is the act of remembering and telling her story that allows Alice to move forward. Reading the novel for the second time this semester with my creative writing students, what stood out to me this time were the images of Dublin, the city I love, so accurately depicted that sometimes I was moved to tears. The novel is about the idea of home and the complexity of deciding where and with whom we make a home, ideas that deeply resonate with so many of us. It's one of the rare novels that has it all, both a light, pleasurable read and a deep, dark, wise story about what it means to be a woman in this world. It's my pleasure to introduce Molly McCloskey.
Thank you for inviting me, and for that lovely introduction, and for the wonderful reading as well. That was really beautiful. So I'm going to read two short sections from the novel. And I'll give a little background on each section, but just in general background. I went to Ireland in 1989, intending to stay for 6 weeks, and came back 24 years later. So I experienced a little bit of that instant love, too, that KRISTA talked about. And coincidentally, the marriage in the novel is bookended by two summers like the one she described. So when you have a good summer in Ireland, it ends up as part of the literature because it's so remarkable. So it was sort of 2 summers, intensely hot heat wave summers, which really changes the way the whole country feels and the way people behave and all of that. And yeah, I forgot it was International Women's Day. And so there is a mother figure in the novel, and the relationship between the narrator and her mother is a very big part of the novel. And parts of the mother are based very closely on my mother, with whom I have a very close relationship. And I said to her when the book was finished, the good news is that there's this portrait kind of based on you, and it's very loving. And the bad news is that you've actually died. The woman has actually died in the novel. So my mother was very good-natured about it and didn't mind the fact that I had, done away with her a little prematurely. So she actually figures into the first part of the first reading I'm going to do. So this is a character who, in some ways, her trajectory is based on my own. She's an American living abroad, and has just come back to Dublin from Nairobi in Kenya, where she was working. And she's come back partly because her mother died, and she's trying to sort of figure out where she belongs and where home is and what home is, and which is a big part of the novel, is that question that, you know, all of us ask at some point, is how do I know what my home is? And also, you know, why do we destroy the homes we have sometimes, you know, whether they're marriages or families or whatever. So, so this is set in a house in near Dunleary Harbor, which is just down the, is that, oh, the picture's gone, but just a little bit down the road from the picture that KRISTA had up. Yeah, this was a house we were talking earlier about places being characters, and we were talking in class about it, the country as a character, but it is also the case that this house was a character in the book. And that happened because in the process of trying to decide where I wanted to live and going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth between the US and Ireland over a 3 or 4 year period, I found myself unexpectedly back in Dublin for a teaching job one semester, and I had actually sublet my own place in Dublin. So I was back in my hometown, what was then my hometown, and I had nowhere to live, which seemed like that was the point I'd brought myself to in this confusion about where to live, was that I was home and had nowhere to live. So so a friend of mine said, well, my parents are going away for 6 months, why don't you, and they're looking for somebody to stay in their house. And so the house turned out to be this €3 million mansion overlooking the sea, you know, just a stunningly beautiful home, full of family things, full of books, full of Irish art, full of all the things that sort of say these are people who know where they belong and where they come from. And so it was interesting because it was sort of a direct contrast to the way I was feeling, and then the house itself became a character in that it was sort of embodying a lot of what I was, you know, trying to figure out. So, so she works for an NGO that in Kenya that has to do with displaced people and things. From my 3rd floor window, I can see the east and west piers of Dunleary Harbor curling like the pincers of something risen from the seabed. I can see the ferries from Holyhead hoving into view, sleeker now than when I was a passenger and less redolent of exile and finality. What I can see, in fact, is my own point of entry, the port at which I first arrived more than 25 years ago. The coincidence thrills me, though it's hardly astonishing. There are few things on earth smaller than this country. The house belongs to friends of a friend, a retired couple who are in Canada visiting their son and will later go to Australia to visit their daughter. I've taken it for 6 months until I decide what to do, where to go. After my mother died, I left Nairobi, where I'd been working for an Irish NGO, and took a consultant's contract and moved back here. They've got me writing a year-end report on our work in the world's largest refugee camp. I'm not sure if that's still true, but at the time. Dadaab in eastern Kenya. This afternoon, I'm meeting the head of our Dublin office to discuss it, though it is already clear to me that it won't differ radically from last year's. It is not that nothing happens in Dadaab. There are, after all, almost 500,000 unhappy people there. It's that many things happen, but very little changes. Today, I've been reading through case studies written by colleagues working in the camp, looking for a bit of human interest I might include. There was a Somali woman named Hamdi who set herself on fire outside the office. She had 5 children. Their father had been murdered by a rival clan, and Hamdi had become a sex worker in the camp to support her family. If she were caught, she risked being burned alive or otherwise put to death. So it was the grimmest of ironies that she had, at the end of her tether, attempted to call attention to her plight by setting fire to herself and almost dying in the process. Apparently, it worked. After several months, Hamdi and her children were resettled in Germany. We can imagine the possibility of a happy ending. Even so, the tale is simply too grisly to include. What I would like to explore in my report, and what it is certainly not my job to explore, is the question of which is more shocking, barbarity or the capacity to survive it. When I started in this line of work, brutality shocked me more. Now survival does. For all the times I've seen people come out the other side of horrors with their sanity seemingly intact, I have never really understood how it is done. I work at a desk beside the window, watching the weather like it's television. This morning it snowed lightly. The flakes were blowing about harum-scarum, and it wasn't entirely clear where they were coming from. Apart from a few tufty and benign-looking clouds, the sky was blue. When the flurries stopped, a haze formed, slowly obscuring Sutton and Howth. A darkish band took shape along the horizon, growing gradually lighter and more diffuse as it rose. The haze thickened to the point of obscuring the sea itself. The fire went out. Howth and Sutton sank. I saw in every direction only a gray mass as solid as a rock face. My mother asked me once, a little rhetorically, "Doesn't anything surprise you?" She meant surprise as in astound. She meant I had no sense of wonder. We were sitting in her living room in a retirement complex in Florida, and she was cooing in amazement yet again as I demonstrated yet again how text messaging worked. I wanted to be able to text each other while I was in Nairobi, and that must have been the 4th time we'd gone over it. Each time she had shaken her head as though witnessing the miracle of flight. I believed that a part of her really was amazed, and I thought maybe she belonged to the last generation capable of astonishment. "It's pretty exciting," I said, with more sarcasm than I'd intended. She looked hurt, and rightly so, and I felt like a bully. Anyway, who was I to scoff? I have no idea how text messaging actually works. And that was when she said it. "Doesn't anything surprise you?" Later, we walked down the back path and sat in a very gentle April sun and waited for the jitney to bring us to the beach. We shared a small bag of potato chips and discovered we both loved the ones with the little pillows of air in them, and neither of us could quite say why, but the discovery felt extraordinary, as though it were something genuinely important, and we could not see why it had taken decades for us to stumble on it. For a moment, she seemed positively girlish, beside herself with delight. I looked at her shyly and had to turn my head away for an instant and gather myself. I think I knew by then. I knew somehow that it wouldn't be long. Still, her death astonished me, like nothing ever has. At some point during my last year in Nairobi, my mother, who had been youthful all her life, even into her 80s, her gait steady, her enthusiasm undiminished, her eyes bright, grew abruptly older. I began to mourn her preemptively. The mere thought of her caused my heart to buckle. While she was still healthy, I made a decision that I would go and live near her, or perhaps even with her, during her last years on Earth. I would go, I thought, before autumn. And then the next time I was visiting, she had a mini-stroke. Was it the first? I wasn't even sure. And I began to panic. After that, I traveled twice in 3 months to see her. When she died, my colleagues thought I would stay in Nairobi. They said, "Don't make any rash decisions and one foot in front of the other." But her death changed me. When I returned to Nairobi after her funeral, I felt my mother everywhere. I was awash in an indiscriminate tenderness I neither expected nor understood. Everything moved me. Everything from a bird call to the green of the grass to the children playing soccer in the pitch near my house overwhelmed me with its life. I swung between a lightness of being that bordered on vertigo and a sorrow that made the least movement difficult. In my grief, I felt awakened to the world, and a strange, acute euphoria sometimes stole over me. What I felt, in fact, was perpetually astonished. Okay, so, excuse me, like Donald Trump snipping at the microphone. So the second piece that I'm going to read is set in 1996, and it's the end of this. You wouldn't know from that previous section that a major sort of plot strand is there's an affair in the novel that spells the end of a marriage. So the narrator's married to this man named Eddie, and the second part, the novel is not linear, so this is actually from almost near the end of the novel, even though it's a long time before the part I just read, which was at the beginning. So it's 1996, and they've decided to split up, and so this is kind of the end of their last kind of weeks together, and then she goes to Dublin to try to kind of gather herself and decide what to do. And it talks about the changes that were happening at that time, which we talked a little bit about in the class today. And when I went to Ireland in '89, it was a very poor country. It was kind of, it was one of the poorest countries in the EU. And, by the mid to late '90s, it was one of the wealthiest. And so a lot changed in that time. So this passage makes reference to the changes, especially the visual changes that are going on. There were huge construction booms, and I was living in Dublin at the time, and you would suddenly see that something was gone. It had been knocked down, and it was happening so much and so fast that you wouldn't be able to necessarily remember what had been there, and already it was gone and something else was going up. And so it was a very strange time. It was a kind of remaking of the landscape as well as kind of the country and what people did with their time and how they viewed themselves. As I was saying in class, it was like everybody won the lotto or the lottery. And, you find out things about yourself, I think, when you win the lottery and see what you decide to spend your money on. So, okay. As the days and weeks passed and summer turned to autumn, we grew wearier and more estranged. Eddie's silences seemed to harden, and every day I tried to imagine my future and went blank with panic. One night, it was the last time we went out together socially, we attended a party in the flat-roofed hotel on the bridge. An old friend of Eddie's had returned from America to celebrate the 50th wedding anniversary of his parents, a couple who had treated Eddie when he was growing up like another son. Eddie insisted I didn't have to come, and I insisted that I wanted to. I think I was trying to stage civility between us, to put us in a situation where we had to act the part. I thought it would give us some relief from ourselves. And though the choice of occasion was a bit masochistic, a fact we acknowledged with an exchange of a brittle smile, I was trying to feel, too, that I didn't have to hide. Lately, I had avoided town as much as possible. There are no secrets in a small Irish town, not for long, and I knew there'd been gossip about us. The previous week, I had met Eddie in town for a lift home, and we had walked from Wine Street to the car park on the Quays. I realized that I was trudging behind him in the manner of a bad dog, and I gave myself a quick mental slap, looked sharp, and straightened up and met the eyes of anyone we passed. What I remember of the party that evening is a low red sun visible from only one corner of the room, through the picture window, but suffusing the whole room briefly with a rose-colored light. I remember feeling cut off from everyone, as though I were behind glass. And I remember a moment when Eddie caught my eye. He was talking to someone, and he offered me the tiniest, most intimate smile. And it was clear that for a split second he'd forgotten the state we were in. It was the old habitual smile, the old warmth, and then very quickly the smile vanished, and his eyes went blank, and it was as though he were looking right through me. We didn't stay long. I think we both felt the awfulness of being there. On my way home, I said that I was sorry I had gone, and he said that he hadn't forced me, and I said, no, I'm sorry. I should have let you go alone. You might have enjoyed it more. I don't think so, he said quickly, and then after a moment, but you're right, you should have. In the end, we simply wore each other out. We agreed that it was over and began the odious task of dismantling our marriage. The autumn saw us ambushed by nostalgia. I suspect it's not unusual. We were spent, and in our exhaustion, all the minor grievances fell away, and a kind of tenderness rolled in. The weather colluded. The heat, which by late August had had us itchy as caged beasts, finally receded. The tar on the roads hardened, the air thinned and grew cool. The earth itself seemed to mellow. In the evenings, the mountain tended toward a pale pinkish yellow. I had a brief fit of domesticity, as though something in me knew that this would be the last proper home I would have for a long time. I made jam from our own raspberries. I weeded the front garden. I even sanded down a desk in the shed, something we'd bought one day at an antique shop in Wicklow with the intention of restoring it. It was like bad triage, letting the very worst thing happen while I busied myself with trivialities. We didn't cook much. Eddie worked late out of what felt like courtesy. Then we'd meet for a bite down in a nearby village because the thought of facing each other for an entire evening at home cowed us. We were frightened and sad, no longer at ease in our own home. After so long at odds with each other, it felt bizarrely that we were in this thing together, the shepherding through of our dissolution, and I had to work not to slide back into love with him. When I left him that October, I went to Dublin. My mother assumed I'd move back to America after the split, but I had no desire to do that. It had been 7 years since I'd lived in that country, and already I'd lost the sense of it. I think I believed, too, that I didn't deserve such a clean getaway. Ireland felt sticky to me, like a room in a nightmare, a purgatory I had to earn my way out of. For several bleak months, I lived with an austerity that strikes me now as melodramatic, but which I know meant simply that I had no idea how to proceed. I rented a bedsit off Haddington Road. I sent my patchy CV to dozens of media outlets and even some advertising firms. Eventually, I got an admin job for an architectural trade magazine housed in a lane off Fenian Street. Within a few weeks, I was writing product features on wallpaper and timber and floor tiling. I felt moored by the work's banality and the ritual of 9 to 5. Occasionally, I joined my office mates for after-work drinks, but always slipped away after the first or second round. I was determined not to lose control. I was trying to put some distance between myself and what had happened. All around me, I saw the city being gutted and rebuilt. There were cranes that looked like giant scissors poised to slice the air, and others that stood straight and proud like T-squares, and others that dangled drunkenly. Buildings seemed to vanish overnight, and in their sudden absence, I could not remember what had stood in the now empty spaces. I thought of a day when Eddie and I were heading out of the city, driving toward the N4, towards the setting sun, and I had actually been with Collie that day. That's her lover. I had actually been with Collie that day. I was not long from his bed, and it seemed the streetscape was rising and falling around us as we went. From everywhere at once came the sound of pneumatic drills ripping through concrete, like the rumblings of war. I think we both felt it, the strangeness and the violence of it all, and neither of us said a word. The winter wore on. At the weekends, people left the city in droves for wherever they came from down the country. And Dublin felt desolate and empty. I'd buy a phone card and call my mother, working hard to sound upbeat, like I was on the cusp of a new life and knew exactly what I was doing. Every time we spoke, she said that if it was really over with Eddie, then why didn't I come home? And every time the question was harder to answer. I couldn't say to her, it would have embarrassed me, that I believed that there might be some nobility in hanging on here, that going back to America would only compound my shame. I thought about Eddie all the time. I wondered how he spent his evenings, what he ate, how he felt when he went to bed at night. I thought of how we never have to face our own absences, the pain they cause, or whatever rushes in to fill the space. I tried not to think about Collie. Then I tried to think very hard about him, as though I could blow a hole right through him and he would disperse like pollen and drift away. I think that's all. Thank you. I'm sure that any place I wrote about I would have visited. I mean, I was there for a long time. So, yeah, definitely. It's a very small country. I mean, you can drive across it in an afternoon. So, yeah, it's not hard to visit everywhere. Although I never knew this thing about you can't say I'm happy. Mm-hmm. Shows what I know. Maybe the family would like field that question.
Oh yeah, I can just say. I mean, I've been writing ever since I've been writing stories and poems ever since I knew how to write. And my family supported me in every possible way and continue to now. So. Yeah, it's one of those things that when you decide to be a writer, you're deciding to be alone a lot and deciding to, when you commit to it, you have to say no to a lot of things. You have to, but ultimately, you have to, commit to it and make it work, and then so it's just a bonus to have everyone around you that actually like just supports you and wants you to see you do the thing you want to do and be happy. So, yeah.
Yeah, my family was the same. In fact, I wrote a memoir before this that was pretty much about my family. It was about my brother, mostly, who's mentally ill. And, you know, they were so great and, you know, shared stories with me and photographs and memories and told me things that I would never have known because I was too young at the time. And so I think I realized at that point just how supportive they were, you know, and how generous they were in letting me tell stories about their lives, which were not always the happiest stories or the stories they were most proud of. So yeah, I certainly have no complaints about my family.